Alright, welcome to today's video. In this video, we are going to talk about the lymphatic drainage of the breast. So let's jump right in. Now, before we talk about the lymphatic drainage of the breast, let's quickly understand what the lymphatic system is, just enough so everything makes sense. Okay? Now, blood normally flows through the arteries, okay, into capillaries to supply tissues, with oxygen and nutrients. Okay, so from arteries, okay, it moves into capillaries to supply tissues, let's say the breast tissues. Okay, so due to hydrostatic pressure, some fluid moves out of the capillaries into the tissues. Now this is what allows the nutrients and oxygen to reach the cells. Now as the blood continues towards the venous end, plasma proteins in the blood creates this oncotic pressure, okay, which pulls this fluid back into the capillaries. Okay, now however, not all the fluid returns. Okay, all right, so about 10% of the fluid remains in the tissues. Okay, so this excess fluid is collected by the lymphatic vessels, right? So you have the lymphatic capillaries here that collects this excess fluid. So this is where the lymphatic system come in. Okay, because if this fluid is not removed, it will accumulate, okay, and cause swelling, which is called edema, right? So from small capillaries, okay, so it moves into larger vessels through lymph nodes where it is filtered, and finally it goes back to the bloodstream. Okay, so that's how the lymphatic system works. So functionally, the lymphatic system does three major things. It maintains fluid balance, it provides a pathway for immune surveillance, okay, through the lymph nodes, and then it removes protein and waste from tissues. So these are the three major functions of the lymphatic system. So now that we've understood briefly how the lymphatic system works, now let's talk about the lymphatic drainage of the breast proper. So I believe it will make more sense at this point. Now, in the breast, the lymphatic drainage is organized based on what part of the breast is being drained. So there are two main groups. Okay, so we have what we call the superficial lymphatics, the superficial lymphatics, and we have the deep lymphatics. Okay, now the superficial lymphatics, they are simply lymphatic vessels that drain the skin of the breast except the nipple and the areola. So the superficial lymphatics essentially drains the skin of the breast except the nipple and the areola. Okay. Now it's important to note that superficial lymphatics of one breast communicate with those of the other breast. So cancer can spread from one breast to the other. Now we also have the deep lymphatics. Now the deep lymphatics are the lymphatic vessels that drain the glandular tissue of the breast, including the nipple and the areola. Okay, so don't forget that the deep lymphatics drain the glandular tissue of the breast, that's the parenchyma of the breast. Okay, including the nipple and the areola. Okay, while the superficial lymphatics drain the skin of the breast except the nipple and the areola. Now there's another important point to note, that there is a plexus of lymph vessels located deep to the areola. Okay, and this plexus of lymph vessels is called the subareolar plexus of Sappey. Okay, so let's write it here. The subareolar plexus of Sappey. Okay, So it's a plexus of lymph vessels that is located deep to the areola. Okay, so lymph from the nipple, the areola, and most of the breast first collect in this plexus. Okay, so from here, it is carried by the other lymphatic vessels to majorly the anterior group of lymph nodes. So this subareolar plexus of Sappey, majorly it acts as a central collecting point, of lymph. Okay. Now, let's look at the major lymph nodes involved in the lymphatic drainage of the breast and their location. So first, we have the axillary group of lymph nodes. Okay, so they lie, around the axilla, and they are divided into four major groups. Okay, even though we have the apical group of lymph nodes also, which is located at the apex of the axilla. Okay, near the clavicle. So in the axillary group of lymph nodes, we have the anterior group, we have the posterior group, we have the central group, and the lateral group of lymph nodes. Okay, so this axillary group of lymph nodes, they form the major drainage pathway of the breast. Okay, so we now have the apical group of lymph nodes, which we've talked about. Okay, and these lymph nodes, they receive lymph from other axillary group of lymph nodes. Okay, and also from the deep parts of the breast. Okay, so another group of lymph nodes we have is the internal mammary nodes. Okay, so they are located along the internal thoracic vessels, close to the sternum, and they receive lymph majorly from the medial part of the breast. So we also have the supraclavicular lymph nodes. Okay, so this is the supraclavicular lymph nodes, and they are located above the clavicle, and they receive lymph from the apical lymph nodes. Okay, so another group of lymph nodes that we have is the posterior intercostal lymph nodes, and they are located at the posterior part of the intercostal spaces. All right, and they receive lymph from the deeper and posterior regions of the breast. Okay, another lymph nodes that we have is the dectopectoral lymph node. Okay, and it's located in the dectopectoral groove. All right, so in addition to these lymph nodes that we've talked about, lymph also drain into the subperitoneal lymph plexus. Okay, now the next thing we'll talk about is how lymph flows from the breast. We'll talk about the flow of lymph through the breast. Okay, now to understand this, we basically divide the breast into four quadrants. You have the upper lateral, the upper medial, the lower lateral, and the lower medial. Okay, so talking about this lateral quadrant, so the lymph from the lateral quadrant mainly drain into the anterior group of lymph nodes, the anterior axillary lymph nodes. Okay, so this is the major pathway of lymphatic drainage of the breast, and accounts for up to 75% of total lymph drainage. Okay, now we have the medial quadrant. Okay, it majorly drains into the internal mammary lymph nodes. Okay, so some lymphatics here can also cross to the opposite breast. Okay, so this pathway accounts for about 20% of total lymph drainage of the breast. Okay, so let's look at the lower lateral quadrant. So some lymph from the lower lateral quadrant, okay, drain into vessels and then into the posterior intercostal lymph node. Okay, so the lower medial quadrant, some lymph drain into vessels here, and then into they communicate with the subperitoneal lymph plexus. Okay, so this is basically um h- how the lymph flows. So when this lymph enters this anterior group of lymph nodes, okay, so we say that most of the lymph goes to this anterior group of lymph nodes. So when it enters the anterior group of lymph nodes, okay, some lymph may also enter the posterior group, okay. So from there, this lymph pass to the central group of lymph nodes, okay. At the same time, some lymph also move to the lateral group. So lymph from here, both the central and lateral group, drain to the pectoral lymph nodes, and then they all drain to the apical group of lymph nodes, which is located, at the apex of the axilla. Then from the apical group of lymph nodes, it now enters, the supraclavicular lymph nodes, okay, located somewhere here. And from these supraclavicular lymph nodes, this lymph now returns through major lymphatic ducts. It returns back into the bloodstream. So basically, that's how the lymph of the breast flows. All right. Now let's talk about the clinical correlates or the clinical implication of the lymphatic drainage of the breast. Okay. Now we have, the peau, the orange. I don't know how you may pronounce it, but peau, the orange. So this occurs due to obstruction of the superficial lymphatic vessels. Okay, so this leads to edema and skin dimpling, giving an orange peel appearance. Okay, so whenever the superficial lymphatic is blocked, okay, maybe due to a tumor or whatever, so it causes um this peel the orange appearance of the breast. Okay, so we also talk about something called Krukenberg's tumor. Krukenberg's tumor. Okay, so this is um a secondary ovarian tumor, okay, that results from spread of breast cancer through this subperitoneal lymph plexus. Okay, so we said that lymph from this lower medial quadrant of the breast can be drained into this subperitoneal lymph plexus. And from here, if there is a cancer in the breast, it can spread through this subperitoneal lymph plexus into the ovary and cause, a secondary ovarian tumor. Okay, and this is called Krukenberg's tumor. Right. So another clinical implication we'll talk about is called the sentinel lymph node. Sentinel lymph node. Now, the sentinel lymph node is the first lymph node to receive drainage of a tumor site. Okay, and it's usually the anterior axillary group of lymph nodes. So we said most of the lymph drain into the axillary group of lymph nodes. So most especially the anterior axillary group. Okay, so the first lymph node to receive drainage from a tumor site, okay, is called the sentinel lymph node. Okay, so and it's important in detecting early metastasis. Okay, so I believe the lymphatic drainage of the breast was explained in a clear and understandable manner. So we've come to the end of this video, and I hope you gained value from this video. So thank you so much for watching, and consider subscribing if you have not, and see you in my next video. Thank you.